Okay. Let's see, we get something in the chat. Let's see if there's any question. Or is it?
Yep, I think we're good.
Okay, no problem with this link. All right, real good. All right. Can anybody see my screen? Am I sharing yet? Let's see what I'm doing here. Stop sharing. You're sharing your screen. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, good morning or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And here we are in November already. It's hard to believe that the year is almost over. And as all of you know, we're stopping, since our book is out and everything, we're going to take a slightly different tact of how these certification classes and workshops are going to continue in the future. And we'll talk about that precisely pretty much in the beginning. But I wanted to let you know that, what is our mission that Bob and I are working on? Is it like, all right, we published a book, we're done with our research, that's it? No, it's just the beginning. And let me just tell you a few of our bullets here. That we have a variety of pretty interesting new things coming up. We have a new YouTube channel that's in progress right now. And Bob just got that working and is working on the final aesthetics, I believe, of it, the banner and all that kind of stuff. And if you look at the very bottom of this page, you could see that's the handle for the YouTube channel. It's our initials and our last name, at DJ Patrichkoff _ R.E. Hoyt is the name of that YouTube channel. And it's a no code data science channel. So we're pretty excited about that. And we'll continue to share all of our videos there.
What about the old channel? Will that still stay alive, or will you incorporate all of what was in the old channel into this one?
Yeah, all the workshop videos have been copied and on the new channel.
Oh, thank you.
So everything is there. So for those of you that want to go back and look at, I'll call them the oldies but goodie videos, if there's such a thing, right? They're all there. Yeah, and so that's what's going on. So so what is our mission? What Bob and I are doing? Obviously, it's pretty clear what our mission is, right? We're on a roll here with machine learning, AI, no code. And we really believe, and we're seeing this in ourselves and also with those people that we're working with, that, our no code data science, it's really allowing you to be part of an elite club of overachieving individuals or professionals who could really integrate predictive analytics and AI into everything you do for your personal work, your employment. If you're an instructor or a consultant, I mean, it has great advantages. I know people who are very, very hard coders, and they love the world of AI because it's helping them be much more efficient with coding, because there's GPT and 4 and a few other things out there that are really helping them be better at their coding. So Bob, just to let you know, Bob and I are also looking at, we're not going to get into specifics, but looking at the next generation. What's after everything we've talked about in this book and what's going on? And we got some really exciting stuff we're working on that we're going to probably bite our tongue for a while on that, because we want to complete it, verify it, and then include that in what we're doing. And so stay tuned for that. And also make sure that you have a look at our YouTube channel and feel comfortable with where all the old videos and things are. And so this same link that we're using right now will be used for next month, the last session. And before I get too deep into this session, what I wanted to do is make sure that we allow anybody who's new for the first time can introduce themselves. I know Huma is new, and I didn't check the list here if there's anybody else new. Huma, do you want to give us a short introduction of yourself?
Of course. Hey everyone, my name is Huma. I'm actually doing my master's in health informatics here at Nova, and I just heard about the class, so here I am.
Great.
Part of the team to learn.
Great. Anybody else here for the first time? Okay, good. So what I'm going to do now is if you look at our book website, nocodedatascience.net, and if you go there and you click on the certification tab, and can you see my screen that I'm showing right now, or I got to stop and reshare?
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
You can see it? Good. So you can see all the tabs here. And for those of you that are familiar with that website, you notice that there's a certification tab there. So what we're going to start in January is certification classes. And that's this pane on the left that I'm scrolling around with right now. You could go there and download that link. You see this little download button. So you could go in there and download that PDF. And so just to make sure you're familiar a little bit with what we're up to, we're going to start in mid-January with what we call 3 levels of classes. And the first level of the class will be 8-week fundamentals, and it'll start every Friday for those 8 weeks at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And if those times don't work for you, you could certainly, you know, watch the video. And there will be a test at the end of that. And it's a knowledge test that you have to complete with at least 70% to get that certificate. The fundamentals at level 1, we call it level 1 fundamental certificate class. It does not involve any kind of Orange or JASP projects or assignments. It's purely fundamentals and knowledge. And there are individuals that have already expressed an interest in that type of a class, so we're making sure that we offer that. Then we have on a different day of the week, and we're going to use exactly the same time that we have right now, Saturdays at 11 p.m. And by the way, that level 1 session class will go for 2 hours, and the level 2 and 3 class will also go for 2 hours straight recorded sessions. In the level 2 and 3 class, that class will be taught together. The only difference now, these are individuals who are not only interested in learning the fundamentals, but they're interested in knowing how to actually do machine learning and AI projects. So these projects will have a whole variety of them, and you could pick and choose what you want. If you want to pick a medical one or a non-medical, that's the difference. And the difference between a level 2 and a level 3 class is the level 2 class. Students will be asked to do projects on a variety of different topics. In the level 3 class, they'll be required to do even more projects. So you really get a really good feeling for what's going on there. So I'm not going to read this whole brochure because you could go there and download it. And we have a section here of, who should attend the classes. Again, what's the schedule? We have here the content of the class, which pretty much emulates everything that we have in the book. There's our bios there. And I'll be teaching those classes, those Fridays and the Saturday classes. And we'll also have a Monday 6 p.m. office hour. And Bob will also join at that time for the office hour sessions. And if you scroll down a little bit further, it talks about, what are the learning objectives for each one of these 3 classes. And then you could see that and study that. And then here it's a little bit more about the class details and the costs. They're available here. The only thing we don't have yet on this certification tab is we'll have some buttons that'll automatically bring those who are interested in that training to a PayPal button. And then we have a little bit in this class, everybody who attends that class will get a complimentary copy of our book. And so that is the brochure we have. Now, just to the right of that, there is a frequently asked questions document that's also available. And if you click on this button that I'm circling right now, you could go there and download that. And there's 4 pages. And I already know by talking with people who have been interested in this, there's a variety of very interesting questions. And I made sure that I included them and anything else that anybody else might think of. And if you're interested in that those classes and have any questions, there's a specific email that I have set up for that. That's also listed right here. You know, davidjohnpatrickskoff@gmail.com. You could send me that and I'll answer any questions on that. So that's the progression and the evolution of where we're going with the workshops. As I said, we'll end them in this format next month. Any questions on these two topics, the brochure or the FAQ, at this moment where I just want to talk about it at a high level?
Just a clarity. So if 8 and 12 weeks, is 12 weeks in addition to the 8 weeks, or it's 4 weeks in addition to the 8 weeks?
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. First of all, you don't need to take level 1 before you take level 2 or 3. So they're not connected with each other. Let's say if you want to take a fundamentals class, which is an 8-week class, you take it, and then after the 8 weeks, you are done. If you take a level 2 or level 3 class, they go on separately. They go on for 12 weeks. Now, you don't need a level 1 certification to hop into a level 2 or 3 class, because the level 2 or 3 class includes all of the fundamentals. It just has a lot more how-to type of techniques to show you, how to really do things and not just learn the fundamentals of the theory. So I hope that clarifies that question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So let's get into the materials for today. So what we're going to talk about is we're going to wrap up between this month and next month, chapter 5. Chapter 5 is all about model evaluation. So up to this point, and if you've been part of these workshops and if you've been part of watching the videos up until now, we've talked about a lot of different things that lead up to, all right, we have a model. Now, how do you evaluate it? So that's what I'm going to go through, and Bob and I will play a little back and forth here. I'll start out by talking about the first sections. I'm not going to obviously read everything, but we're going to first talk about model validation. Now, those of you that are familiar with statistics is very different than machine learning. And what is the biggest difference? Is that in machine learning, what we do is either we always artificially hold back some of our data that we call holdback data, and then we try to use the rest of that data to predict that holdback data to see exactly how good we are in predicting that data. So we play this, I'll call it a game of splitting the data into training and testing. And sometimes we could even split the data into 3 different sections, which is called, training, validation, and test data sets. If you look in the literature, sometimes they'll have different definitions for validation and testing. And we have also in orange, we have something called a data sampler, the data sampler widget, which we've talked about before, and that'll help you split things up into train and test. Now again, why do we do that? Well, because we want to train the data on the train data set, try to figure out what's the best setting, what's the best algorithms to predict the data that we've held back on ourselves, which we call the test data. Now, if you have a really small data set, now what is a really small data set? Well, there's not 100% clarity on that if you look at all the literature and everything, but if you're kind of just in the hundreds of rows of data, you could probably say your data set is probably on the low end side. And especially if you're not above, if you're below 200 data points, and you're really got a small data set. In those kind of situations, you might not want to split your data in advance into training and testing. You could leave it all together and go into orange. Let me pull up my orange file here. Can you see my orange widget?
Yep.
We're full, I just pulled it up. So this is a small example. I got a data set here, which I just happened to pull in This is pulling in the heart disease data set from Orange. And what I'm doing there is I am then just using a logistic regression to find out who had heart disease. Now I could add a lot of, like we've talked before, we could add a lot of other algorithms, but for simplicity, just to make the point here, I just used logistic regression. We do a connector line, so all the data goes into the test and score. Then when I click on test and score, I have the option here. See over here, it says cross validation. So like I said, if you leave all your data together for small data sets and say, you know what, I want to do a 5-fold cross validation, then it will, and I'll go back to the PDF and explain exactly what it's doing. It'll then conduct the analysis and then show you what the results are. And here we are in the test and score widget. I'm evaluating for the target. Yes, they do have heart disease. And then I get the scores for AUC, classification accuracy, F1 precision recall, and Matthews correlation coefficient. Okay. So what is it actually doing there? So let me go back now into the PDF of chapter 5. When I tell it to do 5-fold cross-validation, what is it really doing? And is it really predicting something that it hasn't seen, or what's going on? And so if you do cross-validation with this example 5-fold, you don't have to do 5. You could do 10, you could do 20, or some other number of whatever makes sense for you. And we talk about that, how many folds you should use and things like that. So what's actually going on when I have a 5-fold cross-validation? What it's doing is taking all your data, and in fold number 1, or split number 1, but it's called officially a fold, right? So it's going to, first split here, it's going to, take the majority of the data, 4/5 of the data, if you're doing 5 folds, and put it in the training data section. And it's going to leave 1/5 of the data aside and treat that like unseen data. So it'll not peek at it. It'll just test the algorithm on the training data and then come back and then try to see what it looks like when it goes back and looks at the test data itself. And it'll do that 5 times so that every row of the data that you have will have the opportunity to play, at least once the role of the training data, and also have its opportunity to be part of the test data. So again, we do that typically for smaller data sets, and then we get, that'll give us kind of a hint of what it might look like going forward, and what the results, the performance evaluation metrics of that model will look like going forward. And then we have something, there's a term we refer to that's called internal validation and external validation. Now, what is internal validation? Internal validation is really when you only have one data set and you're validating it on the data that you have. So it's validating it by doing these folds and splits. We call that internal validation. So in other words, the data you brought, it's splitting it up and holding part of that back, to do different types of validation testing. Now, external validation is a little bit different. For example, if you go into a Kaggle competition, or Kaggle, Bob and I are still not quite sure if it's called Kaggle or Kaggle, you will find that they're going to always give you a training data set, and it'll show you, what the target was, and it'll show you all the variables. And then it'll show you a test data set that will show you just all the predictors, but it will not show you what the target value is for that extra data set. Now that is called an external validation data set. So you can't play with it, you can't test with it, you can't do any cross validation with it, because it doesn't have any target variable. So what you have to do is you try to learn as much as you possibly can with your train data, and break that up into test and train and test, and then try to take those learnings to actually predict this external validated separate file, which doesn't have any target variables in there, and that's what you're trying to predict. And then if you're in a Kaggle competition, then that's what you submit. You submit, all right, ID number 1, that's for row number 1 to row 5,000. And the second row that they want to see, okay, what are your predictions for the target variable? And then you have to then show that. So we call that's kind of like an external validation. Now let's say in your hospital, as an example, you have some data, everything's looking good, the performance of your data is pretty high, and so what happens there? Now, do you say to yourself, oh, this is good, everything is fine? But in reality, what's going on is that data is only realistically valid for those people that have gone to that one specific hospital. And it might be a specific part of the population. It might be, it might be a very, economically disadvantaged part of the population that's in the vicinity of that hospital, or it might be exactly the opposite, right? So how do I make sure when I'm doing all that types of analysis that all the analysis that I'm doing is good for the general population and not just for the people that are within driving distance of my hospital? And then that's where if we use the topic and the concept of external validation, where that you might in that situation want to deliberately go out and collect data from other hospitals for other population groups, run it through your algorithm, again, treating it as external validation, and see whether your algorithm that worked may be very good on the population that you're used to in your hospital. Now the question is, does that prediction extend to the general population? And there's a special term in data science, and they refer to that is, they say, does your data generalize well to the general public? And that's what you want to test when you have external validation. And let's say you have another hospital that's 50 miles away, and you analyze that data and you say, oh, okay, we're pretty good at predicting diabetes or whatever you might be interested in predicting. Okay, we're feeling pretty good about this. Do you stop there? No. What you try to do is then continue on with this theme of external validation and go to even more different populations that are maybe in your state or maybe in different states. And then beyond that, you might even want to think about, expanding it internationally and see whether your algorithm works well very much outside the scope of your original data set that you had. So that's the whole concept of internal validation and external validation. And external validation is incredibly important, and you also got to watch out. I mean, there's been some research articles you could read that, oh yeah, they have a disease, they have a wonderful algorithm that's incredibly accurate. Well, guess what? It's only been tested on white people. Now you might say, well, isn't that good enough? What? No, it isn't, because different populations and different cultures, they have they react differently to different diseases, and those studies that only focus on a small population group, whether it be gender, ethnic, or economic strata within the population, they're pretty much doomed. They could be doomed to inaccuracy. That's not always the case, but there's a high probability that they might not be accurate if you don't extend that analysis to other types of groups of the population. And that is why external validation is so incredibly important, is to make sure that you're not only doing wonderful good job of analyze the data you have, but also making sure that you know how to validate that and test it with different external data sets. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bob, and Bob's going to talk about model discrimination and calibration. So
Yeah,
Bob, I'm sharing.
sure.
Yep.
Before I make that switch, though, two excellent questions in the chat. One was, does every model in healthcare have to generalize? That's an important question, because it would be ideal. What they say in a perfect world is you would use external data from a different location or a different time period. And that's what Angie was asking. In other words, if you had the luxury of, say, having 10 years of data in a row, you could train on a certain period and test on another period. But then you have to consider reality, and that is, what if it's during the COVID period? As just an example, because that throws a monkey wrench into that idea. But it's just that there are editorials saying external data is the way to go, but it's rarely achievable. So you have to understand it is a goal to use external data, but it can be hard to find, hard to share. In other words, finding some facility that's willing to share that data. So the other thing to understand is when you use internal validation, you're going to have probably overly optimistic results. When you train on external data, you get more realistic results. So hopefully that answered that. Those are all excellent questions. All right, Dave, so are you going to stop sharing there?
Yes, I stopped sharing. You should
Okay,
be
let me
able to
see.
see if you could pick it up.
Yeah,
Yeah, I see your screen.
okay. So let me go back up. So I'm going to be talking about initially model discrimination versus calibration, which is important and is rarely discussed. Let me just see. There we go. Let me get my own picture out of the way here. So model discrimination is what you generally hear, particularly with binary classification. In other words, you're going to create a model to predict, as an example, who's readmitted to the hospital versus who is not. So the word discrimination here means, can your model discriminate between the two classes, or is there a lot of overlap? We'll see a diagram in a minute that shows overlap, which is important because that's really what you're talking about. Almost never is the prediction perfect. You have false positives, false negatives when you talk about model discrimination. So there's overlap, and that's where you see, again, false positives, false negatives. It's important to realize that, so for model discrimination, the most common method is to just simply set this arbitrary threshold of 0.5. If a data point falls above that, say it's 0.6, it then is labeled as a 1. Let's say heart disease, or they were readmitted. You pick whatever the outcome is you want. So if it's greater than 0.5, it gets put into that bucket 1. If it's, say, 0.1, that's less than 0.5, it's put in the 0 bucket. And hopefully you can see that that's less than ideal. That's the system for binary classification, is ones and zeros basically. But we'll see here in a minute that not every prediction is that way. So now you come to calibration. Model calibration is basically comparing the predicted probability of being a 1 or 0 versus the reality of what is it really. For instance, if you use logistic regression and it predicts heart disease at 0.8, that's pretty close to 1, but it's not 1 exactly. And I highlighted here, model calibration is rarely reported in the literature, unlike discrimination. But it is important. For instance, what if your model predicts things around 1 real well, but around 0 really poorly? So, it won't predict the negative. It will do a good job predicting the positive. or vice versa. We'll show a curve here in a minute. So poor calibration can lead to misleading predictions that certainly impact your decision-making and your model. And this is just, we put the receiver operator curve, and the gray is obviously the area under the ROC curve. So I'm just going to get to some highlights here. I've already mentioned that 0.5 is this default or arbitrary threshold. So that if your data point falls at 0.499, that's considered 0, but 0.501 is considered a 1. And what's important is because they're calculated and the concepts are different, they may not agree with each other. So calibration may be poor while discrimination is good. That's a little hard to wrap your brain around, but that's really the reality. Now, when you use the prediction widget, you start getting predictions for each patient. That allows you to generate a calibration plot. And I'm going to scroll down to look at that. Think about it this way, is if, and I think on the x-axis is the predicted probability, on the y-axis is the actual. So if the two were the same, if it predicted 0.5 and it is 0.5, it would fall in this 45 degree line here. Notice this one is actually pretty good. It's a little off up around 0.9. It's a little low. Around 0, it's a little bit high, but this is actually a good calibration curve. But this is based on, let's say you have 300 patients. This is looking at the probability. How close is the predicted to the actual for all 300 patients? That creates the curve. So, I mean, that's the main point that I want to make out of that. I think I covered that. We do have a demonstration here that, by the way, David and I have never seen this in the book, any book, but we were able to simply take logistic regression, connect it to a data table, and plot this. If you look at this, this is logistic regression. You see the 1 on the right, the 0 on the left. Blue is no heart disease, red is heart disease, as I recall. And you look at the frequency. Notice most are up around 1, but look at the number that are down around, say, 0.6 or thereabouts. So obviously, there are some false positives by the same token. Notice that most of the negatives are close to 0, but then you've got some around 0.4, 0.45, which are probably false negatives. But this is a great demonstration of probabilities not always being perfect. If they were perfect, everybody would be 1 over here or 0. So keep that in mind. In fact, if you create a model, there may be times when you convert it to numerical so that instead of predicting 2 classes, 2 buckets, you do it continuously. It's numerical. You'd be regression. And that may be confusing, but look at this and realize creating a model based on 1 and 0 is not completely realistic, but that's the standard, pretty much what everybody does. Now, you can try to improve the model by using the orange widget called the calibrated learner. And I'm going to scroll down there simply because the setup's a little different. This is how you set it up. And you have that in the chapter. Hopefully everybody got chapter 5. Please put something in the chat if you didn't, and I'll make sure you get a copy of chapter 5. So this is how it's set up. You can then opt to either use sigmoid or isotonic method to try to improve the calibration curve. And then in this particular case, in this particular scenario, it only improved the F1 score slightly. So even though you tried to improve the calibration of it, it didn't have a big result. But let me backtrack to something that's important. Hopefully going backwards, I'll find it. Yes, there is a simple score called a Breyer score that's not part of Orange, but a Breyer score gives you a score of how close the predicted probabilities are to the actual. And so a score of 0 means you got a perfect score. They're identical. one would mean they don't bear any relationship to each other. So a Breyer score is important. In fact, Dave and I really have a friend who's a Python programmer. He created a Breyer score for Orange. We're happy to share that to anybody who thinks they're going to be wanting to look at model calibration, because the Breyer score simply is another way of saying how good is calibration. So this calibration plot is the visual proof, but the Breyer score, so I would think the Breyer score here is going to be really low, like 0.1, something of that nature. But so the Breyer score is one more thing you have that you can measure for model calibration. Okay, now I did put in this chapter, probability odds, odds ratio, and log odds ratios. I'm concerned that if we're going to try to cover all of chapter 5 in 2 sessions, November and December, I'm probably going to have to speed through. Probability is different than odds. Probability is the event will happen, and it's based over all possible cases. So in the example I gave of it being hit by lightning, if 30 were hit and 90 were not, it would be 30 over 120, because that's the total, 120, which would be 25%. And so that's the probability. Odds would be different. That is really looking at those that did compared to those who didn't. And that's 1 in 3. And you can convert back to 1 to each other. So simply the idea that probability and odds are simply stating things a little bit differently. And then looking at odds ratio is odds ratio. The reason I mentioned that in classic, certainly internal medicine literature, using logistic regression, which is pretty much how all the early predictive studies were done, they used odds ratios all the time. And that's why I wanted to mention it, because actually Orange does not produce odds ratios, but in this section here, I show you how you can do that. So when you look at the odds ratio here of a hypothetical case that I created of Roundup exposure, when you calculate the exposed group, which is exposed that developed cancer, yes, exposed but didn't develop, you get a ratio of 0.2. The non-exposed group, you get a ratio of 0.01. So odds ratio is a ratio of 2 ratios, and you come out with 20. 0.20 divided by 0.01 is 20.5. And the conclusion is, therefore, the odds of developing cancer after exposure is about 20 times higher than if not exposed. But that's important. And so I simply say this is a good reminder. Please read this section if you're a clinician, because this is very clinically oriented. This is the kind of things you see in the medical literature all the time. And then I'm going to, again, speed through this part simply to say, I show you how you can calculate odds ratios using these coefficients that you can get from logistic regression and convert them to odds ratios. Why is that useful? Because in the odds ratio, and I'm just going to show you an example, if you calculate the odds ratio for the male gender, it's a 2, which is twice the odds of having heart disease, in other words. And you can just look at each one of those to explain to you how odds ratios are interpreted. All right. So please read that over. I'm going to get to the next session, which is diagnostic test and likelihood ratios. So this is only germane to if you're trying to have a diagnostic test to predict a disease. So some key bullet points here is positive predictive value, which is the same thing as precision, and negative predictive value includes individuals with and without disease, negative and positive, and therefore it's affected by the prevalence of the disease. This caused people to develop a positive likelihood ratio and a negative likelihood ratio. I don't know how many clinicians have taken advantage of this. This is sort of old school, but it's like Bayes' theorem. It should never die. It's still important, in other words. And in fact, I think 20 years ago, I could look this up in the very first Palm Pilots that had calculators. This is how you would calculate it. The formula, though, is pretty simple. for positive likelihood ratio, it's sensitivity divided by 1 minus specificity. And a positive likelihood ratio is the probability that a person with the disease tested positive for the disease divided by the probability that a person without the disease tested positive for the disease, or a false positive. So once again, it is a ratio. So the negative is 1 minus sensitivity divided by specificity. You don't have to memorize that. You've got this as a guide. So just remember, therefore, a positive likelihood ratio helps you rule in a disease, whereas a negative likelihood ratio helps you rule out disease. But both use sensitivity and specificity. A likelihood ratio closer to 1 means the test doesn't really change the likelihood of disease. And here are some numbers, like a positive likelihood ratio between 1 and 3. That's pretty weak. Moderate is more like 3 to 10. Strong would be greater than 10. And then I give you an example from an actual study. And by the way, I was able to create this because they gave me the actual confusion matrix in the study, which I would wish that all studies would do, but they don't. And this is just some of the conclusions based on the likelihood ratio that I calculated, the positive likelihood ratio, 4.85. So that means the probability that a person with ovarian cancer had a positive CT scan is 4.8 times higher compared to people without cancer who tested positive. Because remember, CT scans can have false positives, they can have false negatives, like every other test. And this brings me to the very last thing, and I'm going to be somewhat brief, but I want you all to consider looking at this calculator by Alan Swartz. This is based on something called the Fagan nomogram from Lord, the 1980s, early 80s. The whole idea, this calculator is pretty amazing. You plug in some numbers here, that those tested positive with disease, those tested positive without disease, so forth and so on. And it creates, excuse me, all the numbers for you. It's fantastic, and it gives you the pretest probability. And when you plug in the likelihood ratio, the blue is the positive likelihood ratio, you plug those in, it will give you the post likelihood ratio. So if your pre-likelihood of having a positive test was 60%, but your likelihood ratio is high, and you put it in this nomogram, it automatically says you're basically, what it's saying is your prevalence is high, so your post-test probability is 90%. So it's really based on Bayes' theorem. And why this is important is, if the prevalence of disease is low in your population, then a positive test is more likely to be a false positive. Conversely, if the pretest probability is very high, a negative test does not rule out disease. That's why this section is very important for clinicians to understand. For instance, if you're dealing with a population that's very low breast cancer, a positive mammogram is probably a false positive. Hard to, there are studies out there that will really emphasize that very clearly to you. Dave, I'll back up some of these diagrams. There we are. Orange model evaluation widgets. You're going to do test and score, and I'll stop my share. Are you able to share?
Okay,
There we go.
Can you see Ms. Green?
Yes.
Okay, we're good. Let me get back to here. Scroll down to where you finished up. Okay, so orange model evaluation widget. Now, before we get into that, let's talk about where we are. Throughout the entire book, we mentioned this 8-step discover process, and discover actually stands for something. It's an acronym. And you can see this process again, which again, we show throughout the book, and we have this "you are here" arrow that keeps on moving as you progress through the modeling process. And here's where we are right now. We're verifying model performance with these model evaluation methods and metrics. So as I showed you before, where do you find these model evaluation metrics? Well, they are in the test and score widget. And let me pop that up again, just so you remember where that is. You know, you're done your analysis and you say, all right, how good is everything? Well, you have these metrics right here. Now, going back into, we show here an orange workflow of a small data set. As I mentioned previously, small data set, no data splits. And here you happen to see there are 3 algorithms attached to this analysis: logistic regression, random forest, and SVM. Now, we would prefer that you use as many algorithms that you could possibly do that are available to you. This is just an example. We are definitely not endorsing to say, all right, here's the 3 algorithms you should always use. You should use as many as you possibly can. And we've talked about that before. And if you load up, you know, Orange with all the algorithms that are available and some of the algorithm options, you probably get up to about 27 different widgets that will show you what's going on. And it'll show you which one of them is better than the other by going in the test and score widget. And that's incredibly important to understand, what algorithm has the best predictive power. Because every data set you get into, the last thing you want to do is say, oh, you know what, logistic regression, lasso, always works great for me. That's going to be my go-to algorithm. That would be a mistake. That would be a flaw. And we talk about that in the book also, where that we call that the no free lunch theorem, where that if you have, if you're only using one algorithm because it's your so-called favorite, chances are you're missing out on predictive opportunities. Because if you look at studies on the no free lunch theorem, it'll tell you that over, an infinite variety of different data sets, the predictive power of every individual algorithm is pretty much the same. The probability that it's going to be the best. So how do you get around that? How do you make sure that you find out what the best algorithm is for your data set? How do you do that? You load it up with all the different opportunities that you can add in Orange. And we talk about 26 only because that covers a lot of them. You could actually do a workflow with 50 if you wanted to. And because each of these algorithms not only have some basic settings, but they also have some other fine-tuning parameter settings. And if you wanted to create a separate widget for those settings, you could create a workflow that could easily exceed 50. But in reality, what you want to do is let's say if you start out with a workflow, let's say with 26 algorithms, and then if you have 3 or 4 that are really at the top of the performance in that horse race, so to say, what would you do? What I would do is I would probably spend most of my hyperparameter tuning efforts on those 3 best models to see if I could even get more performance out of them. And the reason why I'm giving you a long monologue on that is I don't want you to think that, okay, here's what I should be doing. I should always be using 3 different algorithms. That's just as an example in this story of, to make it a little bit easier to read the graphic. But keep in mind when you got a life and death and very serious mission critical predictive situations, you always want to use and add as many algorithm options as possible. So what do we know out of this data set? We know that it's small, right? We already mentioned that. We only got 303 patients. So in this example, we connected the file directly going to the test and score widget. One connector. And what happens when I do one connector? Let me go back in here into my workflow. And if I double click these connectors, they're actually options. If I double click on that connector, you can see there's different types of options that I have, you know. And if I had a data split, like if I had a data split option, then I could send the training data to the test and score separately from the testing data. And then in that widget, in the test and score widget, I could say, you know what, show me just my training results. And then also show me just my testing results. And how do I do that in that widget? Let me open that back up. You double click on the test and score widget. And if you're just doing cross validation, you would have the top option selected. But there are other options. There's leave one out, test on train data, and then you could also test on the test data and just see how it did, of how this model performance is if I just tested on the test data. But I'm not going to do that for this data set because I combine all of them into one group of data heading from the data file all the way into the test and score widget. I did not have the data sampler where I split it into a classic, 70-30 or 75-25% split of the data. And we've shown you this before. If you have, in this example, 3 different algorithms, and you want to see which one performs the best for the data, when you go into the test and score widget, it'll show you the scorecard for all 3 of them. And if you say, hey, you know what, my F1 score is the most important for me, and you could click on that to make sure that it'll sort everything by the highest or the lowest F1 score. And then it'll automatically, like in this example, show you that, if F1 score was chosen as the top sorting feature, it'll say, okay, logistic regression is the best. But again, keep in mind, it's only the best of these 3. And you have many, many different options you could test it against. Now, in another situation where if you have a data sampler, and what does a data sampler do? We've talked about that before. That widget, it'll split the data into whatever type of split you want to have for the data. Like I said, 70-30, 25-75, whatever you want to have. And then you could leave it as one flow coming through, or like is shown here, you could have it, if you double click on this connector line, you then connect, you say the data sampler data should be going, the main data should have a separate stream to the test and score widget. And the remaining data, which is always code word for the test data or the smaller group that you've determined to send there, it's going to also be sent there. And then you could go back and forth looking at what the training data and the test data results actually are. So this shows you, the workflow. And then if you connect these lines as shown on the right, it'll then split it out into those separate streams of data. And then in the test and score widget, you will have different options for testing and checking what's actually going on with each of those separate data sets. How are they performing? So Bob, I'm going to stop share and send it back to you. You're going to talk about the predictions widget.
Okay. See my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I already mentioned that the prediction widget can be used, first of all, used to create the calibration plot, because it generates prediction probabilities for each class on each patient for each algorithm. So that's why you can create, again, a bunch of data points and create that curve. And so that's number one. And so I want to show you the prediction, an example of that as I scroll down here. So this, I think, was the heart disease. Doesn't make any difference. This is logistic regression. So for the first patient, the probability was 0.96. So it was labeled a 1. That's very close. The second one, 0.18, very close to 0. So as you scroll down to number 5, that's the only one that's off a little bit. And understand there were 303 patients. I'm just showing you the first 5. So on number 5, the probability was 0.41, it was 0. So that one was off a little bit. And it was already mentioned that in this situation, your probabilities are never perfect. So let me scroll down a little bit further here. So to look at the predictions here, this is the workflow. It's set up a little bit differently. In other words, so here's a data sampler, excuse me, where the main training data goes to logistic regression, then on to prediction, and then the remaining data goes as data to the prediction. And that's just the workflow that you have to do in order to generate this. The other thing, though, is when you do it this way at the very bottom, it gives you what's very similar to test and score. It'll give you A1, AUC, classification accuracy, F1, and so forth. And then another, let me see if I think that's in the workflow, is also, as David indicated, if let's say you set up a model to predict who is going to churn or quit a subscription service, and you feel like you have a really good model, and now you want to test it on patients, or excuse me, subjects, clients, customers. You've got 10 new customers, and you want to see what the likelihood is that they will churn or quit. What you can do, and they explain it in the help menu, how to set it up, so that then you run those new 10 patients into the prediction, and it'll specifically give you the individual predictions on those 10 patients. So that's kind of a real world, more of a live kind of model. And we did not include that workflow, but if you, as you know, you can click on the widget and go to the help menu, or you can go to Orange Data Mining and look at the widget gallery. Either way, but it'll show you what that workflow is. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Dave. Let me stop my share.
All right. All right, everybody can see my screen?
Yep. It probably
Confusion.
enlarged slightly, though, if you can.
Yes. There we are. So, confusion matrix. It's a very interesting slogan for a matrix, confusion matrix. Why in the world do they call it that? It actually, this matrix confuses most people. It's very, very confusing to understand. And why is it called the confusion matrix? What it's really trying to tell us, how confused, excuse me, was the algorithm or algorithms as it was trying to explain its predictions. Did it mix up false positives with false negatives? And what was that structure of that mixing up? So let's walk through that, what that looks like. So we have in a confusion matrix, we have true positives and we have false positives. So it really gives us, and I'm going to zoom in over here on the left bottom. We could see here on the left in this situation, we have an actual, 0 and 1. What does that mean? It means the actual was a yes, or the actual was a no. And then what's the predicted? And then when the predicted zeros and ones, if they line up with each other, let's say the actual was a no, call it heart disease, and the predicted was no heart disease, that's a true negative. But if the actuary said no heart disease, and then the prediction said no, we predict heart disease, we call that a false positive, in this case, falsely identifying, in that case, heart disease. And then one below that we have here again, if we said, yeah, it actually did had heart disease, but the prediction was no, we call that a false negative. And when they line up with each other, the one and the one lines up with each other, the actual says yes, heart disease. The prediction says yes, heart disease. We call that a true positive. Now, in reality, you don't get perfect models. It just doesn't happen that way. And if it does, you should be incredibly suspicious, because that would be a situation of the model is too good to be true. And you will run into these kind of situations where you say, wow, should I right away publish this article? I think I discovered the cure for disease XYZ, or I know the root causes. Well, before you get too excited, what you might want to do is have a very close look at your data set and see if any of the results from your analysis found its way or snuck its way into the data set that is allowing the training data to cheat and be able to forecast something, that it really shouldn't be able to forecast. Like if you have, let's say, diabetes, and if you also have in the data set, you have a column for what's their glucose level, well, that's very highly correlated with diabetes. You say, oh my goodness, look at how accurate that algorithm is. I'm so excited. I must really be doing something right. Well, again, go back and see what you did, and if there's some columns of data there that really is making things look too good to be true. So that's important. Another thing, when you're doing a quick scan of this confusion matrix, and you can see here there's 4 opportunities in this case. 2 of them are red. And what are the reds? That's always false this or false that, false negative or false positive. The blue is kind of the code for, okay, that's, true negative, true positive. But let's say if I found over here 170 over here, and I only found 23 over here, then that is pretty much a key right away, without even having to go and look at and create the calibration curve that Bob even showed you. You would know just from these numbers that it is out of whack. It's going to be, that curve is not going to be real close to the 45-degree angle with a slight S curve around it. It's going to be way off on the right or way off on the left, because, depending if this number is much bigger than this one, the false positives bigger than the false negatives, it'll veer off in one direction. So that's another thing. If you're looking at your calibration curve and see that it really digresses dramatically off to the right and nowhere near the diagonal line, or goes almost straight up, you will know that there is either the false positive or the false negatives highly outnumbers its counterpart of false prediction. Now these 4 metrics that we get out of the confusion matrix is rather interesting, because from those 4 data points alone, we could calculate all kinds of stuff, all kinds of very, very popular metrics. And we showed you and gave you a copy some time ago of all a simple Excel spreadsheet that I had created at one point, and it automatically calculated all kinds of metrics. We just show right here in this table the main ones. And these ones happen to be all calculated. If you look at the formula, it's somewhere in there is a true positive and a true negative, and it just has different ways of looking at it and showing you what's going on. And you have more details here as you go through this part of the chapter, talking about more of the detailed definition of each one of these metrics. But keep in mind, all of these are created from just those 4 different elements of the confusion matrix: false positive, false negative, true negative, false positive. So, Bob, I'm going to hand it off to 4-4, hand it off to you to the rock curve. We call it a rock curve. It means, what does that stand for? Anybody care to guess what the rock curve stands for? It's the area under the curve of the rock curve. And I'll let Bob get into that. So I'm going to stop sharing, Bob, and let you take it from there.
And who can tell me, again, test your memory here, what's the origin of the receiver operator characteristic curve? Think of the word operator. Where did it come from? What was the vintage or era? Anybody remember? You can unmute and tell me. Well, to answer, it was radar operators back around World War II that were trying to discriminate between, is this a cloud or an enemy aircraft? And they were just early on with radar. It wasn't very good, as you can imagine. And so that's what happened, is they created this receiver operator curve for that purpose. And I showed you all that live demo or interactive demo where you can shift the curve, the threshold, so that now you have more airplanes or more clouds, and you could differentiate or you could look at the change as a result. So let's see if we got it. What I wanted to show you is, remember I mentioned when you talk about just model discrimination, what you're really saying is you want to be able to discriminate, in this case, between sick and healthy, or it could be heart disease, no heart disease. And in a perfect discriminator, there'd be no overlap. Everybody would be above this threshold of 0.5. They'd be over on the right, or they'd be over on the left, all negative. But as Dave mentioned, it never happens. So here you see false positives and false negatives. That's an excellent way to look at the receiver operator curve. And the point is, you can, though, as I mentioned, you can shift the curve. We spent a lot of time on all the different ways to shift the curve for imbalanced data, just to try to maximize your results. Most of the time, your threshold is going to be about 0.5. That's up here. In again, your curve, your receiver operator curve, is based on plotting the true positive rate on the y-axis versus the false positive rate on the x-axis. Generally, the curve should look like this and be up far in the upper left portion. Why? Look at it this way. You want the true positives to be very high, around 1, and you want the false positives to be close to 0. So that means the curve would be way up here. But you can shift the curve, and this is just to recall what we went over before, is if you shift to the curve, a threshold instead of 0.5 of 0.6, your recall falls, your specificity increases, and your false positives drop. Remember, everything's a trade-off. So let's go the opposite direction. We changed the threshold to 0.2. What did that do to sensitivity or recall? Oh, it greatly increased it. But notice the false positives. A lot of these positives are false positives, and the specificity dropped. So the reality is you're probably stuck with a compromise of roughly 0.5, where recall is 0.7, specificity is 0.7. So that's just a reminder that you can shift it. And the AUC is called a lot of different things. It's called the C statistic, which stands for concordance statistics. You don't see that very often, but it represents the average value of sensitivity for all values of specificity. Remember, this curve should not look smooth. This one isn't smooth because each one of these is a new threshold, a new false positive, a new true positive to create a new data point. That's why the curve looks that way. So the AUC represents the ability of the test to discriminate between positive and negative cases, or as the example I gave you, those people who were readmitted versus those people that were not, regardless of prevalence of this disease. So it considers the entire range of sensitivity and specificity values at different thresholds. Remember that the AUC is the gold standard by and large for discrimination. However, if you have class imbalance, remember, like let's say you only have 10% of the people were readmitted and 90% were not, then the AUC is not quite as accurate. So a couple other pearls, and I'll be done with this, is note that changing the threshold does not change how the curve look. So it really doesn't change the AUC curve or AUC. Moving the threshold has, again, significance, as I already said, in that, for example, for a screening test, you want a threshold with higher sensitivity, whereas for a confirmatory test, a high specificity is desirable. That's up to the clinicians. That's why clinicians need to understand the confusion matrix, and they need to understand receiver operator curve. So it's a trade-off, again, for a given clinical scenario. How many false positives are you willing to accept? Because they're the ones that generate the alerts, and that causes alert fatigue. Here is the links to a couple of videos. If you need reinforcement, I think that will do it. Dave, I'm going to stop the share. We're really at pretty much the usual stopping point, and we're pretty much on schedule. We weren't sure if we were or not. So in any case, I see Cass put in correctly World War II. I think we should probably stop and entertain any questions. What do you think, Dave?
Yes, I agree.
Okay. So we'll pick up next time. We'll spend most of our time on finishing the orange widgets, but also covering the explain section, which is important as well. There's some widgets there. So that's what we're going to concentrate on next month. Any questions? Please unmute and tell us your question. I hope this was something that was not too difficult to understand, because I think chapter 5 is very important. Chapter 6 you can do on your own. If you learned enough from chapter 4 and 5, chapter 6 should be relatively easy for you.
So I think that wraps it up, Bob.
Okay. All right. Well, enjoyed it. As always, I'll get up with Maria and try to figure out why she can't install Orange. And so, again, take care. We'll see you next month, and we'll send out reminders.
Everybody have a great weekend.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.